The ranger led the party as the sun rose on them. He already knew, but the sight shocked the other two. A battle had played out. The remains of the two forces lay scattered about. Clara whispered a prayer for the fallen as they moved on. None could tell as to who the victor was in this skirmish, let alone when the next clash would be. Welcome to Mythical Phylogeny Adventures. I'm your guy, Jason. Today, I want to look at who would win a war between a fantasy world versus or a modern one. We need to make a few assumptions right off the bat. There isn't a hard line on the powers of magic within a fantasy setting. Generally, I want to look at the medieval era, say 13th and 14th century. Much later, and guns will start showing up and become more powerful. So, just sword and spell level of fantasy. After that, we need to address the dragon in the sky. In most series, magical creatures are said to be powerful. Dragons are nearly invincible, and heroes like Achilles only being harmed on his ankle in most takes. So, can a bullet pierce a dragon's hide? For this, I am going to assume that dragons are just really tough and would need a weapon of similar caliber, such as an elephant rifle being used on elephants. And this needs to apply to weapons and armor, that they operate as expected. I mean, if you claim that you can make impenetrable armor, is it? Or is it just by the limits of the world? Sorry, but there is no way around these issues. Lastly, we are assuming magic is fairly common. In a world where magic is very limited, it would basically just be the ancient warriors fighting modern warriors. And, well, we all know how that would go. Nor can I look at every conceivable spell. Any writer could wand wave in a spell that does whatever the plot needs. Let's start with standard troops. Modern soldiers with guns versus magic warriors. Well, plate armor won't hold up to assault rifles, most likely. And a gun has much more range than a bow, and even more than a sword. So the question then comes down to magical attacks. Could a spell match the damaging potential of a bullet? Now, in most games, spells have a limit in attack range due to game balance, and some should be limited. But there is one which would definitely be on a comparable speed, one which you would unlikely be able to react to, and that is lightning magic. Yet, I need to consider a sniper rifle. Not the usual loadout for a soldier, but it is very powerful here. One marksman aiming from cover or under camouflage could take out a few mages. And how much faster is aiming a rifle versus casting a spell? The longer the cast time, the greater the advantage that a gun would gain. Fireball spells could be comparable to grenades in concept, minus the extra damage from shrapnel. Though grenades have the advantage of being lobbed over obstacles, so you won't need line of sight. But a fantasy world could create a form of explosives using alchemy in glass bottles. Up close, things change. If you are fighting in a building, long range is out. The true power of a rifle is lost. This is the reason why modern soldiers still have combat knives. So, a knife versus a magic sword? Someone who has spent years mastering it. Up close, a fantasy warrior would probably win. Their armor would probably have very little trouble with a knife, and Kevlar armor doesn't offer the same protection. Mind you, there could be spells which boost physical traits. Mind you, there could be spells which boost physical abilities, which would give the fancy warriors an advantage. But there are a couple more factors to look at for just soldiers. First is loot. I mean, that is the first thing you do in a video game. When you defeat a boss, you loot it. And this was a common practice throughout history. You take their weapons. And how long before each faction would learn to use them? Well, for a fantasy warrior, it wouldn't take too long to figure out a gun. Oh, their aim would suck at first. And they would be very limited in ammunition. And I doubt they could figure out how to make more very quickly. Yet, how long would modern soldiers take to figure out a wizard's staff? A long time. Unless they could get scrolls and potions. Yeah, the fantasy world takes this part too. And for the biggest issues is the support gear. Modern soldiers have drone scouts, night vision or thermal goggles, and so forth. A ranger with a hawk matches the drone. Now, fantasy series have no limit to the spells in existence, and this is the real game changer. And this brings up things like charm or fear spells. These could fracture the discipline of modern soldiers, and they would probably have no way to counter this. If used well, a charm spell could get soldiers to betray the rest of the modern army. And that isn't the most powerful spells. It isn't a damaging spell, or a crowd control spell, but straight up healing magic. Modern soldiers are trained in first aid, but that is a stopgap compared to closing wounds or mending broken bones. Magic can get soldiers back on their feet in an instant, rather than just keeping them alive. It is rare, but if a powerful healer could even perform resurrection magic, that means death isn't the end. So, do they have more heals than modern soldiers have bullets? That is what it will come down to. So, the modern soldier would need to follow standard PvP strategy and take out the healer first. Oh, and then we have the dark arts, necromancy. Would bullets kill a horde of zombies, skeletons, or ghosts? That depends on a few things, but definitely more difficult. But the range could mean the undead troops could spawn in the middle of the modern soldiers, spreading chaos. Yet there is another type of spell which would be an issue. I touched on rangers using birds to scout for them. But what about shapeshifting? This means that a druid could easily sneak into the ranks of modern soldiers and transform within their camp or behind their forces. And what are the modern soldiers to do? Shoot every animal that they see? Yeah, that isn't a good situation. Overall, when it comes to just basic soldiers, I feel those of a fantasy world would have the advantage. Not in a straight up brawl, but in their flexibility and adaptability. By relying on subtle tricks, deception, and healing, they can win through a fight of attrition. Yet, there is a factor which we need to address. How can they move? For most fantasy series, people travel on foot and horseback. And that is slow. 15 miles a day or 24 kilometers per day, on average on foot. An average horse can get 35 miles a day or 56 kilometers per day. But modern soldiers would have trucks, jeeps, and tanks, which can cover those distances in under an hour, even on dirt roads. They dominate this. And that hasn't brought the full power of a tank up. Heavy armor and a powerful gun. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that it could wipe out a raid group of adventurers in a few shots. And could they do anything about it? Well, if heated up, it becomes an oven, which would cook those inside. And so, a heat metal spell would be effective. And lightning magic would have the same problem as before. A fantasy world could ride an animal, but chances are it wouldn't match the tank's power. On the naval front, it is even more lopsided. Most fantasy series have galleon-class ships and below, ones that take months to cross an ocean, and cannons which can reach a couple hundred feet at best, compared to a modern warship whose cannons can reach miles. This isn't even a competition. The only way that a fantasy navy could compete is if they have magic to create massive waves. Even then, modern warships are engineered to take it. Oh, and these same ships can offer their crew some protection against lightning. Well, their best long-range attack is out for mages there. Their best option is a rust or heat metal spell if they can get close. If not, the aid of merfolk would be invaluable here. Oh, and we got one more domain, aerial combat. In fantasy series, some fly on the back of griffins and other winged beasts. Others have flying ships and brooms. And a few have personal flight spells. And how does that compare against a fighter jet or a helicopter? The jet has incredible speed, long-range missiles and guns. Most flying beasts won't take a missile, except for a dragon. And that is questionable how well they can take a missile. I'd wager even a dragon's scales would struggle against a missile. Honestly, the best option for a fantasy warrior would be a personal flight spell here. It would make them small enough that it might be difficult to target, and most flight spells would allow for the most mobility to evade attacks. But due to the jet's speed, a mage would struggle to hit it without a tracking spell or a lightning spell. And again, modern planes are designed to take lightning. So, a mage's best options would be, again, a rust spell or a heat metal spell. But against such a fast-moving object, it would be nearly impossible. And with flight comes stealth bombers, flying far too high and fast to catch, going about at night to make it harder. They could rain destruction at an alarming rate, while in near total safety. Now, I don't think someone from a fantasy world could learn to fly a plane. Well, not without crashing, and that will most likely end it. A boat, a submarine, a truck, or a tank, they could fumble through it and learn it with some luck and time. Yet, with some work, a modern soldier could figure out a flying ship or how to ride an animal with the same amount of work. Oh, satellite surveillance might be available depending on how things work out. That could offer plenty of information. And that does bring up the option of space-based weapons existing. And a fantasy world would have almost no way to handle them without them learning how to work a computer, and that is a stretch. Then we have communication options. Radios offer instantaneous relaying of information, which is a huge advantage in battle. Now, a fantasy army will need to travel to pass information by horseback and whatnot. The only exception is if there is a communication spell or mirror. Without that, the fantasy army is at a disadvantage. And that brings up the last resort, nuclear weapons. I'm not sure if a barrier spell could protect a fantasy army from the blast and they wouldn't expect the radioactive fallout afterwards. So little they could do against that. Power like this is rare in most fantasy series, and usually viewed as a cataclysmic disaster. There is one group of spells which might offer the fantasy army an advantage on mobility, and that is the teleportation spells. Even if it is a complicated spell, it could help them get into secure areas of the modern army's base and take out their troops. Overall, I think the modern military has the advantage using their machines, but will struggle in direct combat against the fantasy warriors. Without the modern weapons of war, they would probably lose. They would need to strike hard and fast, and press the advantage of mobility and communication. A fantasy army would be dependent on stealth and manipulation to stand a chance. And against such spells, the modern military would have no way to counter it. A long, drawn-out fight would favor the fantasy army. Adam avoided the sight about him as they trudged over the battlefield, the casualties of their prey. Looking ahead, he saw the cavern, and inside Marcosius. He steeled himself for what was about to unfold. This is an interesting argument, wouldn't you agree? I could see this going either way, depending on the world building and conditions behind the conflict. Both forces would need to adapt to the abilities of the other. Each would need to play to their strengths. And this isn't even all the spells that could be used. Thank you for watching, adventurers. Please return next time for the kobold and how it ties to the goblins. Until then, I'll see you on the roads.